All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope that your first round of speeches are going well. I've been hearing good things from lab instructors, so a lot of you probably have already given your first speeches. Some of you might be giving them this week still. I tried to tell you that I set up this course to give you a lot of the history and theory you need in order to make it through that first speech in the first half of the semester. The trade-off that comes with that is that between now and the end of the semester, you have 2 more speeches to give. So I'm going to apologize, but I'm really not all that sorry that I'm going to already spend today talking about speech 2, looking ahead. So we're going to talk a little bit about technical communication. This is the time of the semester where students are pretty likely to burn out. You just gave your first speech, you're heading into your midterm exam, you have 2 more speeches to give between now and the end of the semester. So I want to take today as a break from all of that and help you all with inventions so that you can get a good head start on that second speech. So we're going to talk today a little bit about technical communication. We're going to talk about it in a couple different senses. So before we get there, what I'd like to do is start off with this week's participation question. Your participation question is a continuum from A through F up here of which of the following best describes where you're at professionally. I'm interested in hearing where you are in terms of your studies, where you are in terms of your professional development as you head toward a career. So you might be a brand new first semester, first year student. You might have no idea what you want to major in yet. You also might be about to graduate and you might already have a job lined up. I'm guessing that a lot of you are somewhere in between on this continuum. What I'd like you to do is try and figure out where you best fit. I'd like you to go ahead and log into Blackboard. We're in week 8. Jalen has a question for me. That's the question. All right. Jossie, sorry about that. Yep. No, I called you by the wrong name. I apologize. So go ahead and log into Blackboard. We're in week 8, and answer where you best fit. You don't necessarily have to put it in complete sentences. You can just leave the letter A, B, C, D, E, or F. If you happen to run into any trouble with Blackboard or you're not sure if it's working, you can go ahead and email your participation question to your lab instructor. We try to keep the grading for COM 110 centralized, and that's the easiest way to do it. So send it to your lab instructor rather than to me. If you send it to me, I'll probably forward it to your lab instructor. But nevertheless, you should figure out where you're at. As you're doing that, you can take the rest of today's class period to complete that and figure it out. But as you're doing that, I'm curious how many of you would identify with A. You have no idea what you want to major in yet. It's okay, there's usually a couple, 1 or 2. Is there anybody in this room? Not yet. Wow, that's impressive. Usually I have quite a few hands up for that one. I never really know what I'm going to get when I pose that. How many of you think you have a couple ideas for possible majors, but you haven't declared one yet? So maybe you're down to a short list of 3 to 5 things you might major in. Anybody in that camp? No as well, okay. How about you've declared a major, but you're not sure if you're going to stick with it? Maybe you've already declared a major, but you're thinking about another major. Okay, there we go. We got a couple of those, okay. You've declared a major, but you don't know what job you want to get with it yet. Usually this is a lot of people, okay, fair amount. You've declared a major and know what kind of job you want. Okay, I'd say the majority in this room of the people so far. How many of you are about to graduate and already have a job lined up? Is anybody in that camp? No, okay. So I never know what to expect when I ask that. Usually in the fall, I have more students who are toward the beginning of the spectrum. So your class is actually a little pretty far on the spectrum here. None of you yet, as far as you are willing to identify, has a job lined up for when you graduate. But the important thing here is to recognize that your professional development is a process and that each of you, when there's 300 of you in this room, will be at a different point in that process, and that's okay. So some of you still may not know what you want to do yet. Some of you may change what you want to end up doing. It used to be the case that with my parents' generation and their parents' generation, a lot of people would go to college, they would choose a major, they'd stick with that major, they'd get a career in that major, and then they'd do that work in that field for the next 30, 40, or 50 years until they retire. It's less so the case with my generation and your generation that people pick one job or even pick one major while they're in college. It's much more common for people to change majors. If that's you, that's okay. I recommend that if you're going to change majors, you don't change it every day of the week. You probably want to pick one pretty early on in your career and stick with it. But it's not all that uncommon for undergraduates to change up their major. It's also not uncommon for people graduating in today's workforce to have more than one job. A lot of people will work in multiple different professions and possibly even different industries. I've seen studies that say the average right now for people graduating is somewhere around 6 different jobs over the course of a lifetime. So even if you answered E or F for today's question, you probably will want to head into a career in your field, but you may find 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now that you want to go back to school and try something new. Or you at least want to take the skills that you learned from here and try and get a different job with those skills. Regardless of where you're at on this continuum, I want this second speech to be about you and your professional development. I want you to be able to move from the step that you're at to the step that you're about to go to, even if that step that you're about to go to is to get a job and have that job and use the skills that you're learning now. So this second speech is intentionally a little bit open-ended, but it's designed to be a little bit of a professional speech. And regardless of where you're at here, you can still do that. I'm going to use today's lesson to give you some ideas about what you might do and how you might do it for that second speech. Before we get there, I want to talk about today's topic, and that is the phrase technical communication. We're talking about technical communication. I'd like to do just some free word association in terms of connotation or in terms of images. What comes to mind when you hear the term technical or the phrase technical communication? What do you hear? What are some other things that you think about when you hear those terms? Detailed instructions. A lot of technical communication is maybe a process of how to do something start to finish. That process usually gets into a lot of specific details about what to do and how you're supposed to do it. Okay, good start. Somebody else? Yeah. Analyzing, is that what you said? What are you analyzing in technical communication? Sorry, you got to speak up a little bit. Okay, so we're analyzing speeches or analyzing how we communicate information. Oftentimes when we communicate technical information, we have to do so in a user-friendly way. What comes to my mind when I think of technical communication is my car manual. I usually pull out my car manual when I am in an emergency. I'm curious if any of you in here have actually read your car manual cover to cover. Anybody? I had like 5 in my last class, and I was fascinated by that. I've never had that many people answer yes to that question. Most of you don't want to read your car manual cover to cover, and the reason for that is because it's often not all that useful. Technical communication doesn't read like a novel. It doesn't have a plot. It doesn't engage us. Most of the time, if we're looking for technical information, we're looking for how do I solve this problem that I have in front of me, or how do I do this task that I'm about to do. And it's usually organized in such a way that I can flip through it pretty quickly and find what I'm looking for. So if I have an emergency light come on my dashboard and I don't know what it means, I go to my car manual and I pull it out, but I'm probably not going to memorize my car manual. That's a lot of what people tend to think of when they think of technical communication. The other thing that people tend to think about is communication in the workplace. And most of the time, communication in the workplace consists of things like emails or reports or presentations or documents that are shared among different colleagues within the same department. So a lot of people think of technical communication, and I think the stereotype of technical communication is Dilbert. It's an old white guy sitting in a cubicle. He probably doesn't like his job all that much. He's probably typing up some reports that either nobody's going to read or only a handful of people are going to read. He wants to communicate that information as clearly as possible, but also in a really succinct way that it's not thousands of pages that some CEO has to sift through. That's a lot of what people traditionally think of as technical communication. I used to teach a class on technical communication. I'll get into more detail about that later. But that's a lot of what I was trained to do, and that's what I trained my students to do, until I realized that technical communication in the 21st century is changing a lot. Technical communication is less resembling of the car manual and is starting to look a little bit more like graphic design. So technical communication can be artistic, it can have style, it can be creative. Less than reading a car manual, a lot of you are probably more inclined to maybe go to YouTube and look for a video that gives you instructions for how to change your tire or how to jumpstart a car. You're probably going to do that in a more creative way, and it's okay to have fun with technical communication. Nevertheless, when people often think of technical communication, what they think of is usually something that's dry and boring and really detail-oriented and specific. And that's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about in terms of technical communication can be that, but the term technical actually has a root that goes back much longer. You can probably guess where I'm going with this. It goes back about 2,500 years. It goes back to ancient Greece, and it goes back to some of the same discussions that Plato and Aristotle and the Sophists and others were having about language and about speech in particular. The term technical actually comes from a Greek root meaning basically a profession. The word in Greek is a techne. A techne is a profession that somebody could gain expertise in, would spend a lot of time studying, would have lots of skills to practice, would be able to teach those skills. Essentially, a techne in ancient Greece was a job that people deemed worthy of spending your life devoting your career to what you would do. And as Plato and Socrates are trying to figure out the various technes in ancient Greece, Plato writes a dialogue called the Gorgias. And Plato's Gorgias, he's fighting with people who claim that they are experts in speech. They claim that they're experts in training people how to speak effectively and how to get what they want. There were a lot of these people in ancient Greece. They were called logographers. And the logographers were basically people like me, but with a little bit less ethics. So they were people who were very well trained in the practicality of giving good speeches, but they didn't have such good training in what we talked about last week with communication ethics. And the reason I say that is because these people were charging incredibly high fees. They were willing to work for whoever wanted to come their way, and they were willing to help those people become the most effective speakers at what they wanted to do, even if those causes were a little unethical. And Plato's Socrates is talking to some of these logographers, and Gorgias happens to be one of them. And he's talking to them and he says, okay, you claim to be experts in speech. And Plato actually uses this dialogue to coin the term rhetoric. When he coins the term rhetoric, he says that rhetoric or public speaking or oratory is not a techne. That is, even if it's something that someone can specialize in, it's not necessarily a good thing. It's much less like a profession, it's much more like a hobby. And part of why Plato feels this way is because some of these same logographers were people who were pushing the government to go to war. And there was a giant war that happened that Plato witnessed, and that war did not go particularly well for Greece. The Peloponnesian War ended with lots of catastrophic consequences for the people who decided to wage it. And so Plato's very concerned and says that you can't actually major in speech, or you can't have a career in speech. They didn't really have a university system. They didn't really have professions in the way that we think of them today. But he said that speech essentially was not something that we should devote our time to, because speech can be co-opted to be evil. Speech can be co-opted to get people to make really bad decisions. And so my dissertation advisor was famous for saying that when Plato coined the term rhetoric, he put the ick in rhetoric. This is the lineage from which we get modern politicians talking about mere rhetoric. It's all fluff and no substance. That legacy has lasted since Plato first coined this term, and since he was first speaking with other public speaking professionals and said, you guys aren't really professionals, you're just kind of akin to bakers, or you're akin to people who don't really have, the high skills that philosophy takes. And that's a legacy that's been around for about 2,500 years. We still see examples of this in contemporary culture, where people say that learning to study speech or learning to study communication is not a worthy endeavor. So I'll pull up this example.
Son, I'm afraid that leg is hanging by a thread.
Jingle must return to game.
Oh, your playing days are over, my friend. But you can always fall back on your degree in communications.
Oh, dear Lord. I know. It's funny, Major. Luchenko learned nothing.
So you can probably tell how I feel about that. I've been getting that for years. I have not one, not two, but 3 degrees in communication. Obviously, I think public speaking is something that we should specialize in and that we should have knowledge in. There is a 20th century rhetorician, somebody in my field named Richard McKeon, who said that rhetoric, or public speaking, is what he called architectonic. In that sense, what he means is that if you are going to major in something, if you're going to call yourself an expert in something, communication is the building block, it's architectonic, of every other discipline that you could find at the university. And his evidence for that is that no matter what field you're in, there is some kind of communication that goes along with that. So I told you I'd come back to when I taught technical communication. The one time or the handful of times that I taught that class was at Texas A&M. And I taught that class not because the communication department decided that we wanted to impose it upon the rest of the university, but because the head of the petroleum engineering department came to us and said, we have a problem here. We need you all to create a class for us. Our petroleum engineers are not doing well. And he said this because he was talking to executives from Schlumberger and ExxonMobil and some of the leading companies in petroleum engineering, so in oil and gas. And he asked those executives, what do you think of our students? And he said, they're really smart, they're really hardworking, they don't know how to speak, and they don't know how to write. And so the petroleum engineering department came to our department and said, we thought we didn't really need communication skills in petroleum engineering, please come help us. And I have another department chair from petroleum engineering on record saying that if you are a petroleum engineer and you can't write a lab report, you can't give a basic presentation, you can't work well with others, you don't have good interpersonal skills, that you're going to have a hard time advancing your career, even in a skill field as technical as oil and gas. You're going to have a hard time moving beyond entry-level jobs into upper-level jobs. That's true of biology, that's true of physics, that's true of chemistry. I've heard that from many different people that think that they don't need technical communication until they do. The sense that we're going to use for technical communication, though, is really more this sense that Plato gave us of techne as a profession. So how is communication going to help you as you go ahead and try to advance your career, regardless of whatever major you're in? Obviously, I'd like for some of you to become communication majors. I'm not here to talk you into becoming a communication major, but I want to brainstorm a little bit what possibilities you might have, and to do that, I'm going to talk about some things that I've learned along my way in my professional development. One of those things, one of the genres that you might be able to use for your second speech is teaching your audience how to write resumes and cover letters. I'm curious how many of you have ever written a resume for yourselves? Okay, a little more than most of you. How many of you have written cover letters before? Fewer of you. That's usually pretty typical. So some of you probably have written resumes. Some of you maybe have written cover letters. A lot of you have not written cover letters. And part of why I want to go into this for a minute or two is because people don't really teach you how to write a cover letter. And it's a really hard thing to know how to do well. So we're going to talk a little bit about those, and we're going to talk about them from the perspective of things that we've talked about in this class. We'll start with resumes, and I'll tell you that when you're writing a resume, or when you're writing a cover letter for that matter, one of the things that you need to be thinking about is thinking about how you want to craft your resume using the 5 canons. Resumes are not just some document you put together the night before you put your application together. Usually they take time. Usually you want to go canon by canon. A lot of people don't take the time to do this well. When I taught technical communication, I used to assign resumes and cover letters, and I can tell you I saw a lot of really bad examples of both of them. So your first draft of it is probably not going to be the best draft that you're going to have. So I want to take this time to help you with something that you can do professionally. One of the things that you'll be thinking about is what to include and what not to include in your resume. Some of you might not have a whole lot of job experience, but you might have to be able to figure out how to talk about internships that you've had, or talk about teams that you've been a part of, or talk about leadership experience you've had, even if you haven't yet been able to work. As you get older, a lot of people will keep their resume and have everything that they've ever done listed on their resume, and that's actually a bad approach as well. One of the challenges of doing a resume is figuring out, okay, I've been in my career 10 or 15 years. What are some of the things that don't belong on this resume? What are some of the things that actually make me look bad because they were things I did in high school and college that are very different from what I'm expected to do now? That's pretty similar to invention. Another way of thinking about resumes is that historically a lot of them have been chronological in nature. What that means is as you're cataloging jobs that you've had, you list them in the order that you had them. So you might have started 5 years ago and you work up to the present, or more often than not, you start with the present and work backwards to the last 5 years and you list the jobs that you had. A lot of resumes today are actually moving away from that chronological model and instead moving toward what's called a functional resume. And a functional resume is not necessarily what jobs I had in what order, but instead, how are my jobs organized based on the skills that I used to have in those jobs? So you might have had gaps in your work experience or jobs that were kind of menial that were not directly related to your field. And if you only go chronologically, it doesn't highlight those skills and values that you have. And so sometimes you might actually consider a functional resume that's not listed by time chronologically, but instead is listed topically by the skills that you had in that job. That's an organizational issue, and that is similar to our arrangement patterns. As you're listing jobs that you have, most of you know that you're supposed to list underneath them different skills that you've had, what kinds of things that you've done. The words that you choose, the action verbs that you choose for how you explain your daily tasks matter a lot. That's a matter of style. Last but not least, you want to consider the design or layout of your resume. As a lot of resumes go digital, they're not as cookie cutter as they used to be. It used to be that you had to buy special resume paper that you would print your resume on. It used to be that it had to be in black and white. It used to be that it had to be one page and straight down the page. A lot of people are playing with graphic design. So you can play around with resumes a little bit using the 5 canons. Another thing that you can do with resumes, and what you should be doing, is thinking critically about audience analysis. When I look at resumes from students, when I look at resumes from people who are applying to jobs, what I often see are people thinking about listing, why do I want this job? It's that self-centered mindset that we talked about with audience analysis. I want this job because I want to live in California. I want this job because I majored in this and this is a job in my field. I want this job because X, Y, and Z. What companies are looking for instead is actually, what can you do for them? Oftentimes, if there's a job posting, it means somebody just left. It means somebody recently quit or was fired, or it could mean that the company is expanding and they want a new leadership team. It's much less about what you want out of the job and more about figuring out what the company can get from you. What are the skills and values that I can bring to the table? Cover letters are kind of a different beast. I was asking my students yesterday about the differences between cover letters and resumes, and one of my students made a really pretty brilliant speech analogy with that. She said, your cover letter is kind of like your introduction, and your resume is much more like your citations. And I really like that, because the citations are proof that you did the work. They're the proof that you did the research, but your introduction is where you get to be creative, where you get to express yourself, where you get to give a sense of your personality. A lot of people write cover letters and they simply just list off the same things that they talked about in their resume. Well, the point of a cover letter is to supplement things that maybe the resume doesn't quite capture. You had this job, but it doesn't show how hard you worked at that job. You had this job, but it doesn't tell the employer what kinds of skills you have or who you are as a person. Another mistake that a lot of people make is they make their cover letters in the wrong style. We're not really accustomed to writing letters anymore. A lot of you probably don't write hard copy letters. Your emails are probably much more informal than the emails that your parents and maybe your grandparents send. As you're writing letters, remember that the letter is actually a genre that you should pay attention to. It should have a greeting. It should have a closing statement. It should be addressed to a particular person. It should be written in paragraphs. It should be polished. It should have an intro, body, and conclusion. Your cover letter is designed to supplement what you have in your resume, and oftentimes what it's there to show is what are your skills, how are you able to do the responsibilities of the job, but also what are your values? Who are you as a person, and how do you fit in with the company values? I told you that when I used to assign these, I saw some pretty bad examples of them. One example that came from one of my students in Texas started with, "Dear hiring committee," or "to the hiring committee. Thank you for considering me for this position. I have been very blessed. Jesus has blessed my family, and I haven't had a whole lot of jobs in the past, but I'm really excited to work hard and to be part of your team. Thank you for your consideration." And I had to sit down with this student. I had to have a conversation with them that I appreciate what they were trying to do in that letter, but that kind of letter would get them directly in the no pile. And I didn't say that to be mean. I said it actually to help protect this student. Some of you looked up at me when I was describing that letter, and you looked a little bit surprised. And I think you probably came to some of the same realizations of why a letter like that might go in the no pile. What are some of those reasons? Why might that not be the best example of a cover letter?
Because you're not selling yourself.
Okay, you're not selling yourself. Say more about that.
So when somebody says, "I have been blessed with the opportunity to do this," you're thanking maybe yourself and other people that have helped you, but you're not really taking into consideration the fact that you have a lot of experience that you're not mentioning.
Okay, so this person didn't have a whole lot of work experience, and I think they were trying to cover for that. How that manifested was, well, I haven't had jobs in the past, and so they weren't selling maybe other experiences that would have highlighted, okay, no, I didn't have a job or an internship while I was in college, but there are other things that I do know how to do from groups that I've been a part of or events that I've helped plan, so they're not selling themselves in that capacity. Are there other reasons why a letter like that might go straight in the no pile? I'm a little frightened that none of you are willing to share, but you're probably thinking what I'm thinking. One of those things is that the student said that they were very blessed that they haven't had to work in the past, that their family and Jesus has provided for them. So they haven't had to work hard in the past. That signals to a company that despite the fact that they say they are willing to work hard, that they haven't yet worked hard, and there might be other applicants in the pool who have that work experience. The other thing is they mentioned religion in this piece. And the student was in Central Texas, and in certain parts of Central Texas, if you identify as a Christian, if everyone at the company identifies as a Christian, and the company identifies by its Christian values and its mission statement, if you're applying for a job to work at a church, for instance, there might be some pockets of Central Texas where something like that might get you consideration. And I think they were trying to do audience analysis. I think the student was trying to say, I'm Christian, the head of this company is probably Christian, and therefore we can build upon that, and that'll work in my favor. What it instead signals to the head of a company, especially a company that employs people who are not Christian or may not be religious at all, is that your Christian values are important enough to you that you're willing to talk about them at work. And maybe you are a good Christian, maybe that means that you have certain ethics, and maybe that's a work ethic or professional ethics or personal ethics that go with that. But nevertheless, it signals that you might actually try to make religion part of your job in ways that would make your coworkers or your boss or the company uncomfortable. And so I had to explain to the student that if he was applying for a job in Houston or Dallas or Fargo or Chicago, that probably wasn't going to fly, and it was probably going to go directly in the no pile. So I share this with you to try and get some of you out of the no pile and at least into the maybe or hopefully to the yes pile.
What about mentioning a church if you've done volunteer experience for a church?
So it kind of depends. Yeah, so in your resume you might list off that you were part of a church group that did some volunteer works and planned some events. I think that's fine. I think what was challenging in this case was in the cover letter, the student specifically said, Jesus has blessed me and my family, in a way that signals it's not just about what I did, but more about who I am. So I'd be cautious about that. Any kinds of demographic information, a lot of companies are legally not allowed to ask you about your age or your religion or your politics or other demographic pieces for that reason. They don't want there to be particular favoritism. They also don't want there to be candidates who would get rejected by volunteering that information. So I share that with you as a cautionary tale to try and protect you. This is just a basic outline of resumes and cover letters, but for those of you who are closer to the end of that spectrum, you probably could give more detailed information about how to write resumes and cover letters in a way that would help you and your classmates get a job. So that's one genre of where you might take speech to. Another genre of where you might take it is explaining what it is that you do and what it is that you don't do on the job. That is actually one of the hardest parts of every single job that I've ever had. You've probably seen those internet memes. They were popular a couple years ago, and it's what this group thinks I do, what this group thinks I do, what this group thinks I do, and it gets to the last one, and it's what I actually do. That's a genre that you might be able to have, and so I might be able to tell you that I used to work at a writing center. And this was actually the hardest time where I had to explain what it is that I did and what I didn't do. A lot of students come to the Writing Center because they think they're bad at grammar, or because their professors sent them to the Writing Center because they think they're bad at grammar. From a Writing Center's perspective, grammar is much more toward the end of the 5 canons. It's that polishing stage that you get to at the end of style. It's that little bits and pieces that don't really matter as much as your thesis statement, your argument, your arrangement, your expression. And so I had to explain to students, yes, I can help you with your grammar, but I'm not here to fix it for you. That's not really what writing centers do. Writing centers are available for everyone at any stage in the writing process, and they're there to help you get to the next step in your writing, regardless of where you're at and how good you are at writing. A lot of students come to the Writing Center with a give me a fish kind of mentality. Give a person a fish and they eat for a day. Writing centers are more like teach a person how to fish mentality. That is, they're trying to teach you if you want to work on grammar, they can help you with grammar, but only if you're really at that stage where you're ready to work on grammar, and in a way that helps you learn the rules so that you don't have to ask anymore. If you struggle with punctuation, if you struggle with transitions, they can help you with that kind of stuff. But I often started sessions at the Writing Center with, well, that's not really what we do, but here's what I can help you with. From there, I went to work at a coffee shop for a little while. I worked at a coffee shop, and my favorite customers who would come in at 6 o'clock in the morning would stare blankly at the menu, and they were usually business people off to work. And they'd stare at me, and they'd stare at the menu, and they'd need a cup of coffee before they ordered their cup of coffee in order to get a cup of coffee. And they'd say, I'll take a grande. And as soon as they used any kind of Starbucks lingo, I knew that I could have fun with them at 5:30 in the morning, and I'd say, no, you won't. And they looked at me funny, and it snapped them out of their funk, and I said, you won't have that because this isn't Starbucks. I was working at a non-Starbucks coffee shop. I like to tease them. That was kind of my banter. When I took that job, my father told me, day one, tell them that a cup of coffee is $5. Day two, tell them that a cup of coffee is $5 with a straight face. I kind of like that. Nevertheless, I often had to explain to customers, yes, I know you want your coffee right now, but this one's still brewing, and if you want it right now, it's not going to taste like coffee because there's not enough beans in yet. We can keep going. I went to work as a summer camp counselor, and when I did that, I would have my father saying, why don't you spend this time getting a job or an internship that'll help you get a career later on? And I said, this is what I'm doing. I'm learning skills at summer camp about how to solve problems. I'm learning skills at summer camp about how to plan events. One of my friends actually has a piece in the New York Times about the value of letting your kids be camp counselors for that reason. I also had campers who would come to me and say, Mommy, can I have a snack at like 11:30 at night? And I would say no to them, and I'd say, A, you don't need any more sugar. You've already had 8 servings of sugar in the last 2 hours, but B, I'm not your mother. From there, I went on to undergrad. And I decided I was going to major in comm, and people said, oh, what are you going to do with that? And I said, teach. And they said, okay, but what if that doesn't work out? And I said, I'm going to teach, and here I am. I also had people say to me, oh, communication, that's a lot like journalism. And there are people in communication who do journalism, but that is the farthest away from what I do in the field that you could possibly get. And so I'd get really annoyed and have to explain that. I then went on to grad school, and we like to pick on graduate students for making poor life decisions, and I think there's some good value in that. Graduate school life is a little bit challenging. I got through graduate school, and now that I'm a professor, I'm constantly fighting with people about what professors do. I have no idea how somebody like Ross Geller on Friends got tenure, knowing that they never show any clips of him in graduate school, and he's constantly at coffee shops and running around with his friends. A lot of people have this perception that professors, if they only teach 2 to 4 classes a semester, that that's all they do, and they only work 6 or 12 hours a week. I'll tell you that it's very rare that I only work 40 hours in a week. Usually it's closer to 50 or 60. Public speaking is a very small part of my job. My teaching part of my job is only about half of my job. I spend a lot of my time doing research on top of that. So I'm constantly having to explain to people like politicians why we should fund higher education and why higher ed salaries are as high as they are. It's because we actually do a lot more work than what gets seen in the classroom. So that's one genre you could have. A related genre to that, not just explaining what it is you actually do, is to try and challenge someone who would give you trouble for choosing the field that you're in. A lot of people like to say, my field is superior to yours, and here's why. Oh gosh, why would you ever go into that field? You're never going to get a job. You're never going to make any money. And I think this is a particularly good example. I have a teacher and slam poet named Taylor Mali. He happens to be one of my favorites. He has an example of what happened when a family member challenged him on his decision to become a teacher.
This poem is called What Teachers Make, or Objection Overruled, or If Things Don't Work Out, You Can Always Go to Law School. He says the problem with teachers is, what's a kid going to learn from someone who decided that his best option in life was to become a teacher? He reminds the other dinner guests that it's true what they say about teachers, those who can do and those who can't teach. I decide to bite my tongue instead of his, and resist the urge to remind the other dinner guests that it's also true what they say about lawyers, because we're eating after all, and this is supposed to be polite conversation. I mean, you're a teacher, Taylor. Come on, be honest. What do you make? And I wish you hadn't done that. Asked me to be honest. Because you see, I have this little policy in my classroom about honesty and ass kicking, which is if you ask for it, then I have to let you have it. You want to know what I make? I make kids work harder than they ever thought they could. I can make a C+ feel like a Congressional Medal of Honor, and I can make an A- feel like a slap in the face. How dare you waste my time with anything less than your very best? I make kids sit through 40 minutes of study hall in absolute. No, you may not work in groups. No, you cannot ask me a question. Why won't I let you go to the bathroom? Because you're bored and you don't really have to go to the bathroom, do you? I make parents tremble in fear when I call home at around dinner time. Hi, this is Mr. Molly. Hope I haven't called it a bad time. I just wanted to talk to you about something that your son said today in class. To the biggest bully in the grade, he said, leave that kid alone. I still cry sometimes, don't you? And that was the noblest act of courage that I have ever seen. I make parents see their children for who they are and who they can be. Do you want to know what I make? I make kids wonder. I make them question. I make them criticize. I make them apologize and mean it. I make them write. And then I make them read. I make them spell. Definitely beautiful. Definitely beautiful. Until they will never misspell either one of those words again. I make them show all their work in math class and then hide it on their final drafts in English. I make them realize that if you've got this, then you follow this. And if somebody ever tries to judge you based on what you make, you give them this. Here, let me break it down for you so you know what I say is true. Teachers make a goddamn difference. And what about you?
So that's another genre that you could take up. I've had students take up this genre and maybe do a refutation of stereotypes about male nurses, or talk about the differences between occupational therapy and physical therapy. There's lots of different ways you could do a speech like that. You'll still have to bring in some resources that are beyond yourself. So his is all him talking, and it's a poem he composed. You'll have to actually back up your claims with evidence, so you'll have to do a little bit of research to do that, but I've seen it done really well. Another genre that you could take is what's called the elevator pitch. The elevator pitch is how you explain an idea that you're excited about to somebody who has the power to make that idea happen. The term elevator pitch comes from talking to the CEO of your company in the time that you would have to ride from the top floor of the building to the bottom floor of the building. How would you sell an idea? The idea that you should hire me. The idea that I have this project that the company should be funding. The idea that you should give me a raise or a promotion. Those are all ideas that you would sell in an elevator pitch. If any of you watch Shark Tank, that's essentially what they're doing on that show as well. I have this invention, I've been working on it, I've put this much of my own money in it. In order to make it really viable, I need a little bit of support from you multimillionaires. Please fund my project so that I can make money with you and we can share in this investment. That's what they're doing in an elevator pitch. So you might have something new in your field that's exciting. Maybe there's new technology. Maybe there's new opportunities. Maybe there's a new idea being developed. Those are all things that you could take the time to explain. A lot of graduate students are unfortunately being tasked with trying to explain their thesis or their dissertation, which is usually somewhere around 200 or 300 words, to people who are not in their field in 3 minutes. There's actually a competition UND is part of called 3-Minute Thesis, where students have to explain in 3 minutes what their dissertation is about, why they study what they study, how they study it, and why it matters for members of the general public. It's a really hard thing to do. A lot of technical communication in the professional sense is really challenging. When you major in something, there's usually language that goes along with that field. That language is usually very specialized. It's what we call jargon. Jargon is one of my favorite words in the English language because it's a fancy word for fancy, complicated words. You have a lot of field-specific words and theories and ideas that you know and other people who study the same thing you do know, but that you forget sometimes when you're explaining to your family members or your significant others or your friends or members of the public to translate for them. And I had a student, after my technical communication class was over, say to me something to the effect of, well, I thought this was a class in helping me speak better to people in my field. I didn't realize I had to dumb down what I was trying to say for people who are not in my field. And I actually think that's a really bad approach that the student was taking, because you spend a lot of time in your field talking to those people. You're probably best at communicating ideas that you're excited about to other people who are also excited about those ideas. What's much harder is to take those things that you're excited about and to take that language and those theories and try to translate them to people who don't study what you do, who don't do what you do for a living. And guess what? A lot of those people are the people who get to make decisions. So when I was in my master's thesis defense, one of the hardest questions I got was, how would you explain your master's thesis and its relevance to the governor? And our governor was not particularly interested in what I had to say in my master's thesis, but he had lots of decision-making power over, say, how much funding the university got, or how much funding even my college or department got. So the elevator pitch is another fun genre where you can try and explain an idea to people who are outside of your field. The goal of this Techne speech is really to translate your passion for your field to other people who may not know what you do, may not get it. So you're going to try and make it as exciting for them as it is for you. A final genre that you could have is to take a concept from your field and try to explain it to people so that they would get it. So I'll demonstrate this one with an idea from communication called Monroe's motivated sequence. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through the details of it. I will also tell you that this idea was first in communication. It's also been taken up by psychology. It's been taken up by business, marketing, advertising. A lot of politicians use Monroe's motivated sequence. A lot of religious leaders use Monroe's motivated sequence. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes demonstrating to you what that is, and then we'll watch a video and we'll see if you can pick out the parts of it. Monroe's motivated sequence, in short, is an emotional roller coaster. It's an actual speech pattern that was designed in the 1930s by a man named Alan Monroe. And Alan Monroe decided, I wanted to take the standard problem solution speech and I want to expand it in a way that really makes sure that people do what I want them to do. So he came up with a 5-part sequence. The second 2 parts, need and satisfaction, are essentially your problem solution speech, but he builds upon that to walk his audience through an emotional roller coaster. He makes them really scared and then really excited and then really curious, and ultimately he says, I want you to go do this thing, here's how to go do it. So we're going to walk through the 5 parts of it, and then I'll demonstrate to you what this looks like. Some of you might be interested in this just because it's useful to get what you want. Some of you also might be interested in it from a professional standpoint as well. The sequence is as such. It goes in order. There's a reason why it's called a sequence, and the first part of that sequence is what Monroe called attention. And this is something that you already know how to do. We spent a lot of time a few weeks ago talking about intros and conclusions. I gave you a whole bunch of the different types of attention getters that are now up on the board, relating the topic to your audience, telling a joke, using humor, telling a story, asking a question. The Monroe's motivated sequence starts off by trying to say, hey, you all might not be listening. There's a bunch of other competing messages out there. Pay attention. And so it finds a creative hook to try and sell you on it. Usually, Monroe's motivated sequence will start with a rhetorical question. It doesn't always have to be that way. From there, what it does is goes directly into the standard problem solution speech. I don't know why Monroe decided to change the names of them, but the second step of Monroe's motivated sequence is what he called the need step. And the need step is the problem. So we're going to walk with a particular problem that I've chosen at random, and that problem is that you all have really terrible dandruff. And so I'm going to tell you that if you have really bad dandruff, people are going to see you and they're going to think you don't shower. And your friends are going to be really grossed out and they're not going to hang out with you. If you try to go on dates, the other person's not going to be interested in you. If you try to get a job and there's dandruff all over your suit or your dress, people are going to say, I don't know if I want to hire this person. They might be the stinky person at work. And essentially, the needs step tries to make that problem as realistic but also as terrifying as it can possibly be. The needs step is to say, you're going to die alone. It's very exaggerated, often to let you know of a problem that you didn't know that you had. As I'm talking about this, some of you are probably itchy, some of you are probably feeling a little bit uncomfortable. That's the point. It's an emotional roller coaster. From there, you can probably imagine that the satisfaction step is going to try and solve that problem. The solution to that problem is that I have a particular brand of dandruff shampoo. Again, I don't endorse this particular product. I just chose one at random. But if I made you really scared with that problem, I can make you feel better by telling you that there's a solution to that problem. And the solution will help solve every aspect of those problems by getting at the root of it. So far, that's a pretty standard problem solution speech. Where Monroe's motivated sequence differs from that is that he added 2 other steps beyond that. And I think these steps are really important because they're leading up to getting people to do what you want. So it's not enough to say there is a problem, there's not enough to say that it's an urgent and serious problem and that I have a solution to that problem. The next step of Monroe's motivated sequence is what he called visualization. And visualization is about telling you how terrible your life will be if you don't follow my advice, or more often than not, how good your life will be if you do follow my advice. It's very rare that they go in the negative direction, although I'm sure some of you can imagine, perhaps in a religious or political context, why people would go to the negative. If you don't do this, you're going to go to hell. If you don't do this, that other person's going to get elected and they're going to enact all these horrible policies. But the visualization step for our example is that if you clean up your dandruff and you no longer have it, you'll get the job that you want, the girl that you want to date will date you, and eventually you'll get to hang out with all of your friends and they'll all like you. The visualization step is not just solving the problem, but getting you to picture how good your future is going to be, and that is to lead up to the final step. The final step is what Monroe called action, and that is getting your audience to do exactly the thing that you want them to do. It's not enough to just picture that future. You actually have to remind your audience very explicitly, usually in multiple ways and multiple times, what you want them to do, how to go do it, how easy it is to go do it. So I used to show an example about donating blood, and this girl from the example would talk about not just that there's an urgent need and that donating blood is an easy process, and also your life will be good because you'll get juice and cookies at the end of it and all this other stuff. But she actually says at the end of her talk how many different places there are to go donate blood. So she says, there's a blood drive happening now. It's at this place on this time. In case you forget, here's a sticker for you to remember, and all these other things. Monroe's motivated sequence is powerful because it walks through that whole emotional roller coaster and is designed to lead to that last step of action. It's not enough to just say, here's what you should go do. It's actually telling your audience very explicitly that they need to go do it now or they're going to miss out. The place where you're most likely to see Monroe's motivated sequence, aside from those kinds of examples from politics, is actually in infomercials. That you will not be able to watch television commercials again without hearing Monroe's motivated sequence. So we're going to watch an infomercial. This is for an actual product, and it's kind of got a funny name to it, but nevertheless, see if you can pick out the steps of Monroe's motivated sequence.
Shoulder strap of your car cut into your shoulder. Is your shoulder strap too tight and annoying? Introducing the Teddy Bear, the cute little guy that eliminates all those problems. Designed to make driving more comfortable, the Teddy Bear snaps onto your shoulder strap and moves up and down to remove the pressure wherever you need it.
My shoulder strap used to pull so tight I could hardly breathe. Now with the Teddy Bear, I really enjoy traveling again.
The patent-pending design swivels to work from either the driver's side or passenger seat and fits all makes and models. Just snap it on, slide it where it relieves the pressure, and drive away. The Teddy Bear stays where you want it until you move it.
My wife used to always complain about the pressure from her shoulder belt. Not anymore.
And the Teddy Bear works so great, he got one for himself too.
The cuddly Teddy Bear is filled with soft, cushy beads, so it snuggles comfortably to your needs. Place it here, or anywhere you need to keep those irritating straps from digging in.
My shoulder strap was always digging in. But the Teddy Bear, it makes it comfortable for me to drive again.
The Teddy Bear works great for men and women and kids of all sizes. It works for everyone, and it's easy to slide out of the way when not in use. The secure snap-on button makes the Teddy Bear safe and fun for infants and small children.
If you're in and out of your car all day like I am, you're really going to enjoy the comfort of the Teddy Bear.
Now you can have your own Teddy Bear and eliminate those annoying shoulder strap pains. Call and order your Teddy Bear right now.
Call 1-800-813-6691 and order your Teddy Bear for just $14.95 plus shipping and handling. Mention this commercial and we'll give you a second Teddy Bear absolutely free.
Because you need 2 of them, right?
Teddy Bears for the lower price of just $14.95. Call 1-800-813-6691 right now.
You probably get the memo. Before you all head out, know that this is a real product designed by a woman with breast cancer. I looked it up. It might be a ridiculous story. It's a problem that you didn't know that you had, that you're probably going to think about the next time you're in your car. Nevertheless, this is another way to use Monroe's motivated sequence. What I want you to get out of today is that you have lots of different options for speech too. that speech is going to happen much faster than you think it's going to happen, so you should probably start thinking about ideas now, even though you might still be tired from speech 1. I'll leave you with that, and I'll see you all next week.